Hey crew, it's Pitt and I am back with some more freedom. Today we are continuing our energetic investment into our union by reading aloud the Federalist Papers. We will be doing Federalist number 38, 39, and 40 today. This is me reading aloud the papers. There is some discussion involved, but for the most part it is just merely speaking aloud the founding principles of our country because I earnestly believe that if the more people who have read and spoken aloud the energy contained in these documents, the better off we will be. It does a very good job of explaining why we have the Constitution that we do. This is the arguments laid out in order to ensure that we did indeed have the Constitution that we do. And so we're going to dig in and see what's up with the Federalist Papers. Grab my glasses. All right, let's go. Federalist number 38. The same subject can wait. No, we're doing 37, 38, 39, and 40. All right, I missed one. All right, take it up. All right. Concerning the difficulties of the convention in devising a proper form of government. From the Daily Advertiser, January the 11th, 1788, James Madison, to the people of the state of New York. In reviewing the defects of the existing confederation and showing that they cannot be supplied by government of less energy than that before the public, several of the most important principles of the latter fell of course under consideration. But as the ultimate of these papers is to determine clearly and fully the merits of this Constitution and the expediency of adopting it, our plan cannot be complete without taking note a more critical and thorough survey of the work of the convention, without examining it on all sides, comparing it in all its parts, and calculating its probable effects. That this remaining task may be executed under impressions conducive to a just and fair result, some reflections must in this place be indulged, which candor previously suggests. It is a misfortune, inseparable from human affairs, that public measures are rarely investigated with that spirit of moderation which is essential to a just estimate of their real tendency to advance or obstruct the public good, and that this spirit is more apt to be diminished than promoted by those occasions which require an unusual exercise of it. To those who have been led by experience to attend to this consideration, it could not appear surprising that the act of the convention, which recommends so many important changes and innovations, which may be viewed in so many lights and relations, and which touches the springs of so many passions and interests, could find or excite dispositions unfriendly, both on one side and on the other, to a fair discussion and accurate judgment of its merits. In some, it has been too evident from their own publications that they have scanned the proposed Constitution, not only with a predisposition to censure, but with a predetermination to condemn, as the language held by others betrays an opposite predetermination or bias, which must render their opinions also of little moment in the question. In placing, however, these different characters on a level, with respect to the weights of their opinions, I do not wish to insinuate that there may not be a material difference in the purity of their intentions. It is but just to remark in favor of the latter description that, as our situation is universally admitted to be peculiarly critical, and to require indispensably that something should be done for our relief, the predetermined patron of what has been actually done may have taken his bias from the weight of these considerations, as well as from considerations of a sinister nature. The predetermined adversary, on the other hand, can have been governed by no venial motive whatsoever. The intentions of the first may be upright, but they may be on the contrary, be culpable. The views of the last cannot be upright, and must be culpable. But the truth is that these papers are not addressed to persons falling under either of these characters. They solicit the attention of those only who add to a sincere zeal for the happiness of their country, a temper favorable to a just estimate of the means of promoting it. Persons of this character will proceed to an examination of the plans submitted by the convention, not only without a disposition to find or to magnify faults, but will see the propriety of reflecting that a faultless plan was not to be expected, nor will they barely make allowances for the errors which may be chargeable on the fallibility to which the convention, as a body of men, were liable, but will keep in mind that they themselves are also but men, and ought not to assume an infallibility in rejudging the fallible opinions of others. With equal readiness will it be perceived that, besides these inducements to candor, many allowances ought to be made for the difficulties inherent in the very nature of the undertaking referred to in the convention. The novelty of the undertaking immediately strikes us. It has been shown in the course of these papers that the existing confederation is founded on principles which are fallacious, that we must consequently change this first foundation, and with it the superstructure resting upon it. It has been shown that the other confederacies which could be consulted as precedents have been vitiated by the same erroneous principles, and can, therefore, furnish no other light than that of beacons, which give warning of the course to be shunned, without pointing out that which ought to be pursued. The most, the most that the convention could do in such a situation was to avoid the errors suggested by the past experiences of other countries, as well as of our own, and to provide a convenient mode of rectifying their own errors, as future experiences may unfold them. Among the difficulties encountered by the convention, a very important one must have lain in combining the requisite stability and energy in government, with the inviolable attention due to liberty and to the republican form. Without substantially accomplishing this part of their undertaking, they would have very imperfectly fulfilled the object of their appointment, or the expectation of the public. Yet that it could not be easily accomplished will be denied by no one who is unwilling to betray his ignorance of the subject. Energy in government is essential to that security against external and internal danger, and to that prompt and salutary execution of the laws which enter into the very definition of good government. Stability in government is essential to national character and to the advantages annexed to it, as well as to that repose and confidence in the minds of the people which are among the chief blessings of a civil society. An irregular and mutable legislation is not more of an evil in itself than it is odious to the people, and it may be pronounced with assurance that the people of this country, enlightened as they are with regard to the nature, and interested, as the great body of them are, in the effects of good government, will never be satisfied till some remedy be applied to the vicissitudes and uncertainties which characterize the state administrations. On comparing, however, these valuable ingredients with the vital principles of liberty, we must perceive at once the difficulty of mingling them together in their due proportions. The genius of republican liberty seems to demand on one side not only that all powers should be derived from the people, but that those entrusted with it should be kept in independence on the people by a short duration of their appointments, and that even during this short period the trust must be placed not in a few, but in a number of hands. Stability, on the contrary, requires that the hands in which power is lodged should continue for a length of time the same. A frequent change of men will result from a frequent return of elections, and a frequent change of measures from a frequent change of men, whilst energy in government requires not only a certain duration of power, but the execution of it by a single hand. How far the convention may have succeeded in this part of their work will appear on a more accurate view of it. From the cursory view here taken, it must clearly appear to have been an arduous part. Not less arduous must have been the task of marking the proper line of partition between the authority of the general and that of the state governments. Every man will be sensible of this difficulty, in proportion as he has been accustomed to contemplate and discriminate objects extensive and complicated in their nature. The faculties of the mind itself have never been distinguished and defined, with satisfactory precision by all the efforts of the most acute and metaphysical philosophers. Sense, perception, judgment, desire, volition, memory, imagination are found to be separated by such delicate shades and minute gradations, that their boundaries have eluded the most subtle investigations, and remain a pregnant source of ingenious disquisition and controversy. The boundaries between the great kingdom of nature and, still more, between the various provinces and lesser portions into which they are subdivided afford another illustration of the same important truth. The most sagacious and laborious naturalists have never yet succeeded in tracing with certainty the line which separates the district of vegetable life from the neighboring region of unorganized matter, or which marks the termination of the former and the commencement of the animal empire. A still greater obscurity lies in the distinctive characters by which the objects in each of these great departments of nature have been arranged and assorted. When we pass from the works of nature, in which all the delineations are perfectly accurate, and appear to be otherwise only from the imperfection of the eye which surveys them, to the institutions of man, in which the obscurity arises as well from the object itself as from the organ by which it is contemplated, we must perceive the necessity of moderating still further our expectations and hopes from the efforts of human sagacity. Experience has instructed us that no skill in the science of government has yet been able to discriminate and define, with sufficient certainty, its three greatest provinces, the legislative, executive, and judiciary, or even the privileges and powers of the different legislative branches. Questions daily occur in the course of practice, which prove the obscurity which reigns in these subjects, and which puzzle the greatest adepts in political science. The experience of ages, with the continued and combined labors of the most enlightened legislators and jurists, has been equally unsuccessful in delineating the several objects and limits of different codes of laws and different tribunals of justice. The precise extent of the common law and the statute law, the maritime law and the ecclesiastical law, the law of corporations, and other laws and customs remains still to be clearly and finally established in Great Britain, where accuracy in such subjects has been more industriously pursued than in any other part of the world. The jurisdiction of her several courts, general and local, of law, of equity, of admiralty, etc., is not less a source of frequent and intricate discussions, sufficiently denoting the indeterminate limits by which they are respectively circumscribed. All new laws, though penned with the greatest technical skill and passed on the fullest and most mature deliberation, are considered as more or less obscure and unequivocal, until their meaning be liquidated and ascertained by a series of particular discussions and adjudications. Besides the obscurity arising from the complexity of objects and the imperfection of the human faculties, the medium through which the conceptions of men are conveyed to each other adds a fresh embarrassment. The use of words is to express ideas. Perspicuity, therefore, requires not only that the ideas should be distinctly formed, but that they should be expressed by words so distinctly and exclusively appropriate to them. But no language is so copious as to supply words and phrases for every complex idea, or so correct as to not include many equivocally denoting different ideas. Hence, it must happen that however accurately objects may be discriminated in themselves, and however accurately the discrimination may be considered, the definition of them may be rendered inaccurate by the inaccuracy of the terms in which it is delivered. And this is unavoidable inaccuracy must be greater or less, according to the complexity and novelty of the objects defined. When the Almighty himself condescends to address mankind in their own language, his meaning, luminous as it must be, is rendered dim and doubtful by the cloudy medium through which it is communicated. Here, then, are three sources of vague and incorrect definitions: indistinctness of the object, imperfection of the organ of conception, and inadequateness of the vehicle of ideas. Any one of these must produce a certain degree of obscurity. The convention, in delineating the boundary between the federal and state jurisdictions, must have experienced the full effect of them all. To the difficulties already mentioned may be added the interfering pretensions of the larger and smaller states. We cannot err in supposing that the former would contend for participation in the government fully proportioned to the superior wealth and importance, and that the latter would not be less tenacious than the equality at present enjoyed by them. We may suppose that neither side would yield to the other, and consequently that the struggle could be terminated only by compromise. It is extremely probable, also, that after the ratio of representation had been adjusted, this very compromise must have produced a fresh struggle between the same parties, to give such a turn to the organization of the government and to the distribution of its powers, as would increase the importance of the branches, in forming which they had respectively obtained the greatest share of influence. There are features in the Constitution which warrant each of these suppositions, and as far as either of them is well founded, it shows that the convention must have been compelled to sacrifice theoretical propriety to the force of extraneous considerations. Nor could it have been the large and small states only which would marshal themselves in opposition to each other on various points. Other combinations, resulting from a difference of local position and policy, must have created additional difficulties. As every state must be divided into different districts, and its citizens into different classes, which give birth to contending interests and local jealousies, so the different parts of the United States are distinguished from each other by a variety of circumstances, which produce a like effect on a larger scale. And although this variety of interest, for reasons sufficiently explained in the former paper, may have a salutary influence on the administration of the government when formed, yet everyone must be sensible of the contrary influence which must have been experienced in the task of forming it. Would it be wonderful if, under the pressure of all these difficulties, the convention should have been forced into some deviations from that artificial structure and regular symmetry which an abstract view of the subject might lead an ingenious theorist to bestow on a constitution planned in his closet or in his imagination? The real wonder is that so many difficulties should have been surmounted, and surmounted with a unanimity almost as unprecedented as it must have been unexpected. It is impossible for any man of candor to reflect on this circumstance without partaking of the astonishment. It is impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive in it a finger that the almighty hand which has been so frequently and signally extended to our relief in the critical stages of the Revolution. We had occasion, in a former paper, to take notice of the repeated trials which have been unsuccessfully made in the United Netherlands for reforming the baneful and notorious vices of their constitution. The history of almost all the great councils and consultations held among mankind for reconciling their discordant opinions, assuaging their mutual jealousies, and adjusting their respective interests, is a history of factions, contentions, and disappointments, and may be classed among the most dark and degraded pictures which display the infirmities and depravities of the human character. If, in a few scattered instances, a brighter aspect is presented, they serve only as expectations to admonish us of the general truth, and by their luster to darken the gloom of the adverse prospect into which they are contrasted. In revolving the causes from which these exceptions result, and applying them to the particular instances before us, we are necessarily led to two important conclusions. The first is, that the convention must have enjoyed, in a very singular degree, the exemption from the pestilential influence of party animosities, the disease most incident to deliberative bodies, and most apt to contaminate their proceedings.
The second conclusion is that all the deputations composing the convention were satisfactorily accommodated by the final act, or were induced to accede to it by a deep conviction of the necessity of sacrificing private opinions and partial interests to the public good, and by a despair of seeing this necessity diminished by delays or new experiments. And so ends Federalist number 37. And here we are pretty much just receiving keep your mind open, right? Do not go into the deliberation or consider the document with the presupposed notion that you are either for it or against it. That is the entirety of this argument. They use a lot of really complicated language to convey something really simple because apparently the more verbose you can be, the better you're going to be received. And that is probably true, especially in those days when education was actually valued. Separately, I'm going to go ahead and say yes to the fact that I just spoke for almost 15 minutes
in my natural voice without having too big of an issue. This is, in part, vocal therapy for me. And the fact that I could do that is absolutely wonderful, and I am blessed by God. Thank you. Now, Federalist Paper number 38.
The same subject continued, and the incoherence of the objections to the new plan exposed. From the New York Packet, Tuesday, January the 15th of 1788, by James Madison to the people of the state of New York.
It is not a little remarkable that in every case reported by ancient history in which the government has been established with deliberation and consent, the task of framing it has not been committed to an assembly of men, but has been performed by some individual citizen of preeminent wisdom and approved integrity. Minos, we learn, was the primitive founder of the government of Crete, as Eleusis was that of Locrians. Theseus first, and after him Draco and Solon, instituted the government of Athens. Lycurgus was the lawgiver of Sparta. The foundation of the original government of Rome was laid by Romulus, and the work completed by two of his elective successors, Numa and Tullius Hostilius. On the abolition of royalty, the consular administration was substituted by Brutus, who stepped forward with a project for such reform, which, he alleged, had been prepared by Tullius Hostilius, to which his address obtained the assent and ratification of the Senate and the people. This remark is applicable to the Confederate governments also.
Amphiticon, we are told, was the author of that which bore his name. The Achaean League was received in its first birth from Achaeus, and its second from Aratus. What degree of agency these reputed lawgivers might have in their respective establishments, or how far they might be clothed with the legitimate authority of the people, cannot in every instance be ascertained. In some, however, the proceeding was strictly regular. Draco appears to have been entrusted by the people of Athens with indefinite powers to reform its government and laws, and Solon, according to Plutarch, was in a manner compelled by the universal suffrage of his fellow citizens to take upon him the sole and absolute power of new modeling the Constitution. The proceedings under Lycurgus were less regular, but as far as the advocates for a regular reform could prevail, they all turned their eyes towards the single efforts of that celebrated patriot and sage, instead of seeking to bring about a revolution by the intervention of a deliberative body of citizens. Whence could it have proceeded that a people, jealous as the Greeks were of their liberty, should so far abandon the rules of caution as to place their destiny in the hands of a single citizen? Whence could it have proceeded that the Athenians, a people who would not suffer an army to be commanded by fewer than 10 generals, and who required no other proof of danger to their liberties than the illustrious merit of the fellow citizen, should consider one illustrious citizen as a more eligible depository of the fortunes of themselves and their posterity than a select body of citizens, from whose common deliberations more wisdom, as well as more safety, might have been expected. These questions cannot be answered fully without supposing that the fears of discord and disunion among a number of counselors exceeded the apprehension of treachery or incapacity of a single individual. History informs us, likewise, that of the difficulties with which these celebrated reformers had to contend, as well as the expedients which they were obliged to employ in order to carry their reforms into effect. Solon, who seems to have indulged in a more temporizing policy, confessed that he had not given his countrymen the government best suited to their happiness, but most tolerable to their prejudices, and like Curtius, more true to his object, was under the necessity of mixing a portion of violence with the authority of superstition, and of securing his final success by voluntary renunciation, first of his country and then of his life. If these lessons teach us, on one hand, to admire the improvement made by government on the ancient mode of preparing and establishing regular plans of government, they serve not less, on the other, to admonish us of the hazards and difficulties incident to such experiments, and to the great imprudence of unnecessarily multiplying them. Is it an unreasonable conjecture that the errors which may be contained in the plan of the convention are such as have resulted from rather from the defect of antecedent experience on this complicated and difficult subject than from a want of accuracy or care in the investigation of it, and consequently such as will not be ascertained until an actual trial shall have pointed them out? This conjecture is rendered probable not only by many considerations of a general nature, but by the particular case of the Articles of Confederation. It is observable that among the numerous objections and amendments suggested by the several states, when these articles were submitted for their ratification, not one is found which alludes to the great and radical error which, on actual trial, has discovered itself. And if we accept the observations which New Jersey was led to make, rather by her local situation than by her peculiar foresight, it may be questioned whether a single suggestion was of sufficient moment to justify a revision of the system. There is abundant reason, nevertheless, to suppose that, immaterial as these objections were, they would have been adhered to with a very dangerous inflexibility in some states, had not a zeal for their opinions and supposed interest been stifled by the more powerful sentiment of self-preservation. One state, we may remember, persisted for several years in refusing her concurrence, although the enemy remained the whole period at our gates, or rather in the very bowels of our country. Nor was her pliancy in the end affected by a less motive than the fear of being chargeable with protracting the public calamities and endangering the event of the contest. Every candid reader will make the proper reflections on these important facts. A patient who finds his disorder daily growing worse, and that an efficacious remedy can no longer be delayed without extreme danger, after coolly revolving his situation and the characters of different physicians, selects and calls in such of them as he judges most capable of administering relief, and best entitled to his confidence. The physicians attend. The case of the patient is carefully examined. A consultation is held. They are unanimously agreed that the symptoms are critical, but that the case, with proper and timely relief, is so far from being desperate that it may be made to an issue of an improvement of his constitution. They are equally unanimous in prescribing the remedy by which this happy effect is to be produced. The prescription is no sooner made known, however, than a number of persons interpose, and, without denying the reality or danger of the disorder, assure the patient that the prescription will be poison to his constitution, and forbid him, under pain of certain death, to make use of it. Might not the patient reasonably demand, before he ventured to follow this advice, that the authors of it should at least agree among themselves on some other remedy to be substituted? And if he found them differing as much from one another as from his first counselors, would he not act prudently in trying the experiment unanimously recommended by the latter, rather than be hearkening to those who could neither deny the necessity of a speedy remedy nor agree in proposing one? such a patient and in such a situation as is America at this moment. She has been sensible of her malady. She has obtained a regular and unanimous advice from men of her own deliberate choice. And she is warned by others against following this advice under pain of most fatal consequences. Do the monitors deny the reality of her danger? No. Do they deny the necessity of some speedy and powerful remedy? No. Are they agreed? Are any two of them agreed in their objections to the remedy proposed, or in the proper one to be substituted? Let them speak for themselves. This one tells us that the proposed Constitution ought to be rejected, because it is not a confederation of the states, but a government over individuals. Another admits that it ought to be a government over individuals to a certain extent, but by no means to the extent proposed. A third does not object to the government over individuals or to the extent proposed, but to the want of a Bill of Rights. The fourth concurs in the absolute necessity of a Bill of Rights, but contends that it ought to be a declaratory, not of the personal rights of individuals, but of the rights reserved to the states in their political capacity. A fifth is of opinion that a Bill of Rights of any sort would be superfluous and misplaced, and that the plan would be unexceptionable but for the fatal power of regulating the times and places of election. An objector in a large state exclaims loudly against the unreasonable equality of representation in the Senate. An objector in a small state is equally loud against the dangerous inequality in the House of Representatives. From this quarter we are alarmed with the amazing expense, from the number of persons who are to administer the new government. From another quarter, sometimes the same quarter on another occasion, the cry is that the Congress will be but a shadow of representation, and that the government would be far less objectionable if the number and expense were doubled. A patriot in a state that does not import or export discerns insuperable objections against the power of direct taxation. The patriotic adversary in a state of great exports and imports is not less dissatisfied than the whole burden of taxes may be thrown on consumption. This politician discovers in the Constitution a direct and irresistible tendency to monarchy. That is equally sure it will end in aristocracy. Another is puzzled to say which of these shapes it will ultimately assume, but sees clearly it must be one or the other of them, while a fourth is not wanting, who, with no less confidence, affirms that the Constitution is so far from having a bias towards either of these dangers that the weight on that side will not be sufficient to keep it upright and firm against its opposite propensities. With another class of adversaries to the Constitution, the language is that the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments are intermixed in such a manner as to contradict all the ideas of regular government and all the requisite precautions in favor of liberty. Whilst this objection circulates in vague and general expressions, there are but a few who lend their sanction to it. Let each one come forward with his particular explanation, and scarcely any two are exactly agreed upon the subject. In the eyes of the junction of the Senate with the President is the responsible function for appointing to offices. Instead of vesting this executive power in the executive alone, is the vicious part of the organization. To another, the exclusion of the House of Representatives, whose numbers alone could be a due security against corruption and partiality in the exercise of such a power, is equally obnoxious. With another, the admission of the President into any share of power which ever must be a dangerous engine in the hands of the executive magistrate is an unpardonable violation of the maxims of republican jealousy. No part of the arrangement, according to some, is more inadmissible than the trials of impeachment by the Senate, which is alternately a member both of the legislative and executive departments, when this power so evidently belonged to the judiciary department. We concur fully, replied others, in the objection to this part of the plan, but we can never agree that a reference of impeachments to the judiciary authority would be an amendment of the error. Our principal dislike to the organization arises from the most extensive powers already lodged in that department. Even among the zealous patrons of a council of state, the most irreconcilable variance is discovered concerning the mode in which it ought to be constituted. The demand of one gentleman is that the council should consist of a small number to be appointed by the most numerous branch of the legislature. Another would prefer a larger number and considers it as a fundamental condition that the appointment should be made by the president himself. As it can give no umbrage to the writers against the plan of the federal constitution, let us suppose that as they are the most zealous, so they are the most sagacious, and of those who think the late convention were unequal to the task assigned them, and that a wiser and better plan might and ought to be substituted. Let us further suppose that their country should concur both in this favorable opinion of their merits and in their unfavorable opinions of the convention, and should accordingly proceed to form them into a second convention, with full powers, and for the express purpose of revising and remolding the work of the first. Were the experiment to be seriously made, though it required some effort to view it seriously even in fiction, I leave it to be decided by the sample of opinions just exhibited, whether, with all their enmity to their predecessors, they would, in any one point, depart so widely from their example, as in the discord and ferment that would mark their own deliberations, and whether the Constitution, now before the public, would not stand as fair a chance for immortality as Lycurgus gave to that of Sparta, by making its change to depend on his own return from exile and death, if it were to be immediately adopted, and were it to continue in force, not until a better, but until another should be agreed upon by this new assembly of lawgivers. It is a matter of both wonder and regret that those who raise so many objections against the new Constitution should never call to mind the defects of that which it is to be exchanged for it. It is not necessary that the former should be perfect. It is sufficient that the latter is more imperfect. No man would refuse to give brass for silver or gold, because the latter had some alloy in it. No man would refuse to quit a shattered and tottering habitation for a firm and commodious building, because the latter had not a porch on it, or because some of the rooms might be a little larger or smaller, or the ceilings a little higher or lower than his fancy would have planned them. But waving illustrations of this sort, is it not manifest that the most of the capital objections urged against the new system lie with tenfold weight against the existing confederation? Is an indefinite power to raise money dangerous in the hands of the federal government? The present Congress can make requisitions to any amount they please, and the states are constitutionally bound to furnish them. They can emit bills of credit as long as they will pay for the paper. They can borrow both abroad and at home, as long as a shilling will be lent. Is an indefinite power to raise troops dangerous? The Confederation gives to Congress that power also, and they have already begun to make use of it. Is it improper and unsafe to intermix the different powers of government in the same body of men? Congress, a single body of men, are the sole depositary of all the federal powers. Is it particularly dangerous to give the keys of the Treasury and the command of the army into the same hands? The Confederation places them both in the hands of the Congress. Is a Bill of Rights essential to liberty? The Confederation has no Bill of Rights. Is it an objection against the new Constitution that it empowers the Senate, with the concurrence of the Executive, to make treaties which are to be the laws of the land? The existing Congress, without any such control, can make treaties which they themselves have declared, and most of the states have recognized, to be the supreme law of the land. Is the importation of slaves permitted by the new Constitution for 20 years? By the old, it's permitted forever. I shall be told that, however dangerous this mixture of powers may be in theory, it is rendered harmless by the dependence of Congress on the state for the means of carrying them into practice. That, however large the mass of powers may be, it is in fact a lifeless mass. Then, say I, in the first place, that the Confederation is chargeable with the still greater folly of declaring certain powers in the federal government to be absolutely necessary, and at the same time rendering them absolutely nugatory. And, in the next place, that if the Union is to continue and no better government be substituted, effective powers must either be granted to or assumed by the existing Congress, in either of which events the contrast just stated will hold good. But this is not all. Out of this lifeless mass has already grown an excrescent power, which tends to realize all the dangers that can be apprehended from a defective construction of the supreme government of the Union. It is now no longer a point of speculation and hope that the Western Territory is a mine of vast wealth to the United States. And, although it is not of such a nature as to extricate them from their present distresses, or, from some time to come, to yield any regular surplus for the public expenses, yet it must hereafter be able, under proper management, both to effect a gradual discharge of the domestic debt and to furnish, for a certain period, liberal tributes to the federal treasury. A very large proportion of this fund has already been surrendered by individual states, and it may be within reason be expected that the remaining states will not persist in withholding similar proofs of their equity and generosity. We may calculate, therefore, that a rich and fertile country, of an area equal to the inhabited extent of the United States, will soon become a national stock. Congress have assumed the administration of this stock. They have begun to render it productive. Congress have undertaken to do more. They have proceeded to form new states, to erect temporary governments, to appoint officers for them, and to prescribe the conditions on which the states shall be admitted into the Confederacy. All this has been done, and done without the least color of constitutional authority. Yet no blame has been whispered, no alarm has been sounded. A great and independent fund of revenue is passing into the hands of a single body of men who can raise troops to an indefinite number and appropriate money to their support for an indefinite period of time. And yet there are men who have not only been silent spectators of this prospect, but who are advocates for the system which exhibits it, and at the same time urge against the new system the objections which we have heard. Would they not act with more consistency in urging the establishment of the latter, as no less necessary to guard the Union against the future powers and resources of a body constructed like the existing Congress, than to save it from the dangers threatened by the present impotency of that assembly? I mean not by anything said here to throw censure on the measures which have been pursued by Congress. I am sensible that they could not have done otherwise. The public interest, the necessity of the case, imposed upon them by the task of overleaping their constitutional limits. But is not the fact an alarming proof of the danger resulting from a government which does not possess regular powers commensurate to its objects? A dissolution, or usurpation, is the dreadful dilemma to which it is continually exposed. And so ends Federalist Paper number 38, and what we get here is basically just the lining out that your arguments don't make any sense. You're arguing for and against the same things. You are asking both for and not to do the same things. And so you're inconsistent in your arguments. If at least you could come with a coherent argument, we could debate it, but you can't. All you can come with is the negative of, well, we don't want this, but you don't have anything to replace it with. And that is, in essence, Federalist number 38. Now to 39. The conformity of the plan to Republican principles, from the Independent Journal by James Madison to the people
of the state of New York. The last paper having
concluded the observations which were meant to introduce a candid survey of the plan of government reported to the convention, we now proceed to the execution of that part of our undertaking. The first question that offers itself is whether the general form and aspect of the government be strictly Republican. It is evident that no other form would be reconcilable with the genius of the people of America, with the fundamental principles of revolution, or with that honorable determination which animates every votary of freedom, to rest all our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government. If the plan of the convention, therefore, be found to depart from the Republican character, its advocates must abandon it as no longer defensible. What then are the distinctive characters of the Republican form? Were an answer to this question to be sought, not by recurring to principles, but in the application of the term by political writers to the constitution of different states, no satisfactory one would ever be found. Holland, in which no particle of the supreme authority is derived from the people, has passed almost universally under the denomination of a republic. The same title has been bestowed on Venice, where absolute power over the great body of the people is exercised in the most absolute manner by a small body of hereditary nobles. Poland, which is a mixture of aristocracy and of monarchy in their worst forms, has been dignified with the same appellation. The government of England, which has one republican branch only, combined with a hereditary aristocracy and monarchy, has, with equal impropriety, been frequently placed on the list of republics. These examples, which are nearly as dissimilar to each other as to a genuine republic, show the extreme inaccuracy with which the term has been used in political disquisitions. If we resort for a criterion on the different principles on which the different forms of government are established, we may define a republic to be, or at least may bestow that name upon, a government which derives all its powers, directly or indirectly, from the great body of the people, and is administered by persons holding their offices during pleasure, for a limited period, or during good behavior. It is essential to such a government that it be delivered from the great body of the society, not from an inconsiderable proportion, or a favored class of it, otherwise a handful of tyrannical nobles, exercising their oppressions by a delegation of their powers, might aspire to the rank of republicans, and claim for their government the honorable title of republic. It is sufficient for such a government that the persons administering it be appointed, either directly or indirectly, by the people, and that they hold their appointments by either of the tenures just specified. Otherwise, every government in the United States, as well as every other popular government that has been or can be well organized or well executed, would be degraded from the republican character. According to the Constitution of every state in the Union, some or other of the officers of government are appointed indirectly only by the people. According to most of them, the chief magistrate himself is so appointed, and according to one, this mode of appointment is extended to one of the coordinate branches of the legislature. According to all the constitutions, also, the tenure of the highest offices is extended to a definite period, and in many instances, both within the legislative and executive departments, to a period of years. According to the provisions of most of the constitutions, again, as well as according to the most respectable and received opinions on the subject, the members of the judiciary department are to retain their offices by the firm tenure of good behavior. On comparing the Constitution planned by the Convention with the standard here fixed, we perceive at once that it is, in the most rigid sense, conformable to it. The House of Representatives, like that of the one branch, at least of all the state legislatures, is elected immediately by the great body of the people. The Senate, like the present Congress and the Senate of Maryland, derives its appointment indirectly from the people. The President is indirectly derived from the choice of the people, according to the example in most of the states. Even the judges, with all other officers of the Union, will, as in the several states, be the choice, though a remote choice, of the people themselves. The duration of the appointments is equally conformable to the Republican standard and to the model of state constitutions. The House of Representatives is periodically elective, as in all the states, and for the period of 2 years, as in the state of South Carolina. The Senate is elective for the period of 6 years, which is but 1 year more than the period of the Senate of Maryland, but 2 more than the Senates of New York and Virginia. The President is to continue in office for a period of 4 years, as in New York and Delaware. The Chief Magistrate is elected for 3 years, and in South Carolina for 2 years. In the other states, the election is annual. In several of the states, however, no constitutional provision is made for the impeachment of the Chief Magistrate. and in Delaware and Virginia, he is not impeachable until out of office. The President of the United States is impeachable at any time during his continuance in office. The tenure by which the judges are to hold their places is, as it unquestionably ought to be, that of good behavior. The tenure of the ministerial offices generally will be a subject of legal regulation, conformably to the reason of the case and the example of the state constitutions. Could any further proof be required of the republican complexion of this system, the most decisive one might be found in its absolute prohibition of titles of nobility, both under the federal and state governments, and in its express guarantee of the republican form to each of the latter. But it was not sufficient, say the adversaries of the proposed Constitution, for the convention to adhere to the republican form. They ought, with equal care, to have preserved the federal form, which regards the Union as a confederacy of sovereign states, instead of which they have framed a national government, which regards the Union as a consolidation of the states. And it is asked by what authority this bold and radical innovation was undertaken. The handle which has been made of this objection requires that it should be examined with some precision. Without inquiring into the accuracy of the distinction on which the objection is founded, it will be necessary to a just estimate of its force. First, to ascertain the real character of the government in question. Secondly, to inquire just how far the convention were authorized to propose such a government. And thirdly, how far the duty they owed to their country could supply any defect of regular authority. First, in order to ascertain the real character of the government, it may be considered in relation to the foundation on which it is to be established, to the sources from which its ordinary powers are to be drawn, to the operation of these powers, to the extent of them, and to the authority by which the future changes in the government are to be introduced. On examining the first relation, it appears, on one hand, that the Constitution is to be founded on the assent and ratification of the people of America, given by deputies elected for the special purpose, but, on the other, that this assent and ratification is to be given by the people, not as individuals composing one entire nation, but as composing the distinct and independent states to which they respectively belong. It is to be the assent and ratification of the several states, derived from the supreme authority of each state, and nothing of the people themselves. The act, therefore, established in the Constitution, will not be a national, but a federal act. That it will be a federal and not a national act, as these terms are understood by the objectors. The act of the people, as forming so many independent states, not as forming one aggregate nation, is obvious from this single consideration, that it is to result neither from the decision of a majority of the people in the Union, nor from that of a majority of the states. It must result from the unanimous assent of the several states that are parties to it, differing no otherwise from their ordinary assent than in its being expressed, not by the legislative authority, but by that of the people themselves. Were the people regarded in this transaction as forming one nation, the will of the majority of the whole people of the United States would bind the minority, in the same manner as the majority in each state must bind the minority. And the will of the majority must be determined either by a comparison of the individual votes, or by considering the will of the majority of the states as evidence of the will of the majority of the people of the United States. Neither of these rules has been adopted. Each state, in ratifying the Constitution, is considered as a sovereign body, independent of all others, and only to be bound by its own voluntary act. In this relation, then, the new Constitution will, if established, be a federal and not a national Constitution. The next relation is to the sources from which the ordinary powers of government are to be derived. The House of Representatives will derive its powers from the people of America, and the people will be represented in the same proportion and on the same principle as they are in the legislature of a particular state. So far, the government is national, not federal. The Senate, on the other hand, will derive its powers from the states, as political and co-equal societies, and these will be represented on the principle of equality in the Senate, as they are now in the existing Congress. So far from the government as federal, not national, the executive power will be derived from a very compound source. The immediate election of the president is to be made by the states and their political characters. The votes allotted to them are in a compound ratio, which considers them partly as districts in co-equal societies and partly as unequal members of the same society. The eventual election, again, is to be made by the branch of legislature which consists of the national representatives. But in this particular act, they are to be thrown into the form of individual delegations from so many distinct and co-equal bodies politic. From this aspect of the government, it appears to be of a mixed character, presenting at least as many federal as national features. The difference between a federal and national government as it relates to the operation of the government is supposed to consist in this, that in the former, the powers operate on the political bodies composing the Confederacy and their political capacities. In the latter, on the individual citizens composing the nations and their individual capacities. On trying the Constitution by this criterion, it falls under the national, not the federal character, though perhaps not so completely as has been understood. In several cases, and particularly in the trial of controversies to which states may be parties, they must be viewed and proceeded against in their collective and political capacities only. So far, the national countenance of the government on this side seems to be disfigured by a few federal features. But this blemish is perhaps unavoidable in any plan, and the operation of the government on the people, in their individual capacities, in its ordinary and most essential proceedings may, on the whole, designate it, in this relation, a national government. But if the government be national with regard to the operation of its powers, it changes its aspect again when we contemplate it in relation to the extent of its powers. The idea of a national government involves in it not only an authority over the individual citizens, but an indefinite supremacy over all persons and things, so far as they are objects of lawful government. Among a people consolidated into one nation, this supremacy is completely vested in the national legislature. Among communities united for particular purposes, it is vested partly in the general and partly in the municipal legislatures. In the former case, all local authorities are subordinate to the supreme, and may be controlled, directed, or abolished by it at pleasure. In the latter, the local or municipal authorities form distinct and independent portions of the supremacy, no more subject, within their respective spheres, to the general authority than the general authority is subject to them within its own sphere. In this relation, then, the proposed government cannot be deemed a national one, since its jurisdiction extends to certain enumerated objects only, and leaves to the several states a residuary and inviolable sovereignty over all other objects. It is true that in controversies relating to the boundary between two jurisdictions, the tribunal which is ultimately to decide is to be established under the general government. But this does not change the principle of the case. The decision is to be impartially made according to the rules of the Constitution, and all the usual and most effectual precautions are taken to secure this impartiality. Some such tribunal is clearly essential to prevent an appeal to the sword and a dissolution of the compact, and that it ought to be established under the general rather than under the local governments, or, to speak more properly, that it could be safely established under the first alone, is a position not likely to be combated. If we try the Constitution by its last relation to the authority by which amendments are to be made, we find it neither wholly national nor wholly federal. Were it wholly national, the supreme and ultimate authority would reside in the majority of the people in the Union, and this authority would be competent at all times, like that of a majority of every national society, to alter or abolish its established government. Were it wholly federal, on the other hand, the concurrence of each state in the Union would be essential to every alteration that would be binding on all. The mode provided by the plan of the convention is not founded on either of these principles, in requiring more than a majority and particularly in computing the proportion by states, not by citizens, it departs from the national and advances towards a federal character. In rendering the concurrence of less than the whole number of states sufficient, it loses again the federal and partakes of the national character. The proposed Constitution, therefore, is in strictness neither a national nor a federal constitution, but a composition of both. In its foundation, it is federal, not national. In the sources from which the ordinary powers of the government are drawn, it is partly federal and partly national. In the operation of these powers, it is national, not federal. In the extent of them, again, it is federal, not national. And finally, in the authoritative mode of introducing amendments, it is neither wholly federal or wholly national. And so ends Federalist number 39. And here we got the technical definition, right? We got to understand the difference between a federal government, which is the composition of the states, and a national government, which is the subordination of all the states to the federal government. We are more federal than national, but we have characteristics of both, and that is absolutely intentional. It is meant to be not majority rules. It is meant to be that way. We are not supposed to be subject to the whims of a democracy. That would be tyranny. And finally, we're going to get to the Federalist number 40. The powers of the convention to form a mixed government, examined and sustained. From the New York Packet, Friday, January the 18th, 1788, by James Madison, to the people of the state of New York.
The second point to be examined is whether the convention were authorized to frame and propose this mixed constitution. The powers of the convention ought, in strictness, to be determined by an inspection of the commissions given to the members by their respective constituents. As all of these, however, had reference either to the recommendation from the meeting at Annapolis in September 1786 or to that from Congress in February of 1787, it will be sufficient to recur to these particular acts. The act from Annapolis recommends the appointment of commissioners to take into consideration the situation of the United States, to devise such further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union, and to report such an act for that purpose to the United States in Congress assembled, and, as when agreed to by them, and afterwards confirmed by the legislature of every state, will effectually provide for the same. The recommendatory act of Congress is in the words following.
Whereas there is provision in the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union for making alterations therein, by the assent of a Congress of the United States and of the legislatures of the several states, and whereas experience hath evinced there are defects in the present Confederation, as a means to remedy which several of the states, and particularly the state of New York, by express instructions to their delegates in Congress, have suggested a convention for the purposes expressed in the following resolution, and such convention appearing to be the most probable means of establishing in these states a firm national government. Resolved, that in the opinion of Congress it is expedient that on the second Monday of May next, a convention of delegates, who shall have been appointed by the several states, be held at Philadelphia, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation, and reporting to Congress and the several legislatures such alterations and provisions therein, as shall, when agreed to in Congress and confirmed by the states, render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union. From these two acts it appears, first, that the object of the convention was to establish in these states a firm national government, Second, that this government was to be such as would be adequate to the exigencies of the government and the preservation of the Union. And third, that these purposes were to be effected by alterations and provisions in the Articles of Confederation, as it is expressed in the acts of Congress, or by such further provisions as should appear necessary, as it stands in the Recommendatory Act from Annapolis. Fourth, that the alterations and provisions were to be reported to Congress and to the states, in order to be agreed to by the former and confirmed by the latter. From a comparison and fair construction of these several modes of expression, it is to be deduced that the authority under which the convention acted, they were to frame a national government adequate to the exigencies of government and of the Union, and to reduce the Articles of Confederation into such a form as to accomplish these purposes. There are two rules of construction dictated by plain reason as well as founded on legal axioms. The one is that every part of the expression ought, if possible, to be allowed some meaning, and to be made to conspire to some common end. The other is that where the several parts cannot be made to coincide, the less important should give way to the more important part. The means should be sacrificed to the ends rather than the ends to the means. Suppose, then, that the expressions defining the authority of the convention were irreconcilably at variance with each other, that a national and adequate government could not possibly, in the judgment of the convention, be affected by alterations and provisions in the Articles of Confederation. Which part of the definition ought to have been embraced and which rejected? Which was the more important, which the less important part? Which the end, which the means? Let the most scrupulous expositors of delegated powers, let the most inveterate objectors against those exercised by the convention answer these questions. Let them declare whether it was of most importance to the happiness of the people of America that the Articles of Confederation be disregarded, and an adequate government be provided, and the Union preserved, or that an adequate government should be admitted, and the Articles of Confederation preserved. Let them declare whether the preservation of these articles was the end, for securing which a reform the government was to be introduced as the means, and whether the establishment of a government adequate to the national happiness was the end at which these articles themselves originally aimed, and to which they ought, as insufficient means, to have been sacrificed. But is it necessary to suppose that these expressions are absolutely irreconcilable to each other? That no alterations or provisions in the Articles of the Confederation could possibly mold them into a national and adequate government, into such a government that has been proposed by the Convention? No stress, it is presumed, will, in this case, be laid on the title. A change of that could never have been deemed an exercise of ungranted power. Alterations in the body of the instrument are expressly authorized. New provisions therein are also expressly authorized. Here then is a power to change the title, to insert new articles, or to alter old ones. Must it of necessity be admitted that this power is infringed, so long as part of the old articles remain? Those who maintain the affirmative ought to at least mark the boundary between authorized and usurped innovations, between that degree of change which lies within the compass of alterations and further provisions, and that which amounts to a transmutation of the government. Will it be said that the alterations ought not to have touched the substance of the Confederation? The states would never have appointed a convention with so much solemnity, nor described its objects with so much latitude, if some substantial reform had not been in contemplation. Will it be said that the fundamental principles of the Confederation were not within the purview of the Convention, and ought not to have been varied? I ask, what are these principles? Do they require that in the establishment of the Constitution the states should be regarded as distinct and independent sovereigns? They are so regarded by the Constitution proposed. Do they require the members of the government should derive their appointment from the legislatures, not from the people of the states? One branch of the new government is to be appointed by these legislatures, and under the Confederation, the delegates to Congress may all be appointed immediately by the people, and in 2 states, are actually so appointed? Do they require that the powers of the government should act on the states and not immediately on individuals? In some instances, as has been shown, the powers of the new government will act on the states and their collective characters. In some instances, also, those of the existing government act immediately on the individuals. In cases of capture, of piracy, of the post office, of coins, weights, and measures, of trade with the Indians, of claims under grants of land by different states, and, above all, in the case in the case of trials by courts martial in the Army and Navy, by which death may be inflicted without the intervention of a jury or even of a civil magistrate. In all of these cases, the power of the Confederation operate immediately on the persons and interests of individual citizens. Do these fundamental principles require, particularly, that no tax should be leveled without the intermediate agency of the states? The Confederation itself authorizes a direct tax, to a certain extent, on the post office. The power of coinage has been so construed by Congress as to levy a tribute immediately from that source also. But pretermitting these instances, was it not an acknowledged object of the convention and the universal expectation of the people that the regulation of trade should be submitted to the general government in such a form as would render it an immediate source of general revenue? Had not Congress repeatedly recommended this measure as not inconsistent with the fundamental principles of the Confederation? Had not every state but one, had not New York herself so far complied with the plan of Congress as to recognize the principle of the renovation? Do these principles, in fine, require that the powers of the general government should be limited, and that beyond this limit the states should be left in possession of their sovereignty and independence? We have seen that in the new government, as in the old, the general powers are limited, and that the states, in all unenumerated cases, are left in the enjoyment of their sovereign and independent jurisdiction. The truth is that the great principles of the Constitution proposed by the Convention may be considered less as absolutely new than as the expansion of principles which are found in the Articles of Confederation. The misfortune under the latter system has been that these principles are so feeble and confined as to justify all the charges of inefficiency which have been urged against it, and to require a degree of enlargement which gives to the new system the aspect of an entire transformation of the old. In one particular it is admitted that the Convention have departed from the tenor of their commission. Instead of reporting a plan requiring the confirmation of the legislatures of all states, they have reported a plan which is to be confirmed by the people, and may be carried into effect by 9 states only. It is worthy of remark that this objection, though the most plausible, has been the least urged in the publications which have swarmed against the Convention. The forbearance can only have proceeded from an irresistible conviction of the absurdity of subjecting the fate of 12 states to the perverseness or corruption of a 13th, from the example of an inflexible opposition given by a majority of 1/60th of the people of America to a measure approved and called for by the voice of 12 states, comprising 59/60ths of the people, an example still fresh in the memory and indignation of every citizen who has felt for the wounded honor and prosperity of his country. As this objection, therefore, has been in a manner waived by those who have criticized the powers of the Convention, I dismiss it without further observation. The third point to be inquired into is, how far considerations of duty arising out of the case itself could have supplied any defect of regular authority. In the preceding inquiries of powers of the conventions have been analyzed and tried with the same rigor and by the same rules as if they had been real and final powers for the establishment of a Constitution of the United States. We have seen in which manner they have been borne the trial even on that supposition. It is time now to recollect that the powers were merely advisory and recommendatory, that they were so meant by the states and so understood by the Convention, that the latter have accordingly planned and proposed a new constitution, which is to be of no more consequence than the paper on which it is written, unless it be stamped with the approbation of those to whom it is addressed. This reflection places the subject in a point of view altogether different, and will enable us to judge with propriety of the course taken by the convention. Let us view the ground on which the convention stood. It may be collected from their proceedings that they were deeply and unanimously impressed with the crisis which had led their country almost with one voice to make so singular and solemn an experiment for correcting the errors of a system by which this crisis had been produced, that they were no less deeply and unanimously convinced that such a reform as they had proposed was absolutely necessary to the effect, the purposes of their appointment. It could not be unknown to them that the hopes and expectations of the great body of citizens throughout this great empire were turned with the keenest anxiety to the event of their deliberations. They had every reason to believe that the contrary sentiments agitated the minds and bosoms of every external and internal foe to the liberty and prosperity of the United States. They had seen in the origin and progress of the experiment the alacrity with which the proposition, made by a single state, Virginia, towards a partial amendment of the Confederation, had been attended to and promoted. They had seen the liberty assumed by a very few deputies from a very few states convened at Annapolis, of recommending a great and critical object, wholly foreign to their commission, not only justified by the public opinion, but actually carried into effect by 12 out of the 13 states. They had seen, in the variety of instances, assumptions by Congress not only of recommendatory, but of operative powers, warranted, in the public estimation, by occasions and objects infinitely less urgent than those by which their conduct was to be governed. They must have reflected that in all great changes of established governments, forms ought to give way to substance, that a rigid adherence to such cases to the former would render nominal and nugatory the transcendent and precious right of the people to abolish or alter their governments as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Since it is impossible for the people spontaneously and universally to move in concert towards their object, and it is therefore essential that such changes be instituted by some informal and unauthorized propositions made by some patriotic and respectable citizens or number of citizens. They must have recollected that it was by this irregular and assumed privilege of proposing to the people plans for their safety and happiness that the states were first united against the danger with which they were threatened by their ancient government, that committees and congresses were formed for concentrating their efforts and defending their rights, and the conventions were elected in the several states for establishing the constitutions under which they are now governed. Nor could it have been forgotten that no little ill-timed scruples, no zeal for adhering to ordinary forms were anywhere seen, except in those who wished to indulge, under these masks, their secret enmity to the substance contended for. They must have borne in mind that as the plan to be framed and proposed was to be submitted to the people themselves, the disappropriation of this supreme authority would destroy it forever. Its approbation blot out antecedent errors and irregularities. It might even have occurred to them that where a disposition to cavil prevailed, their neglect to execute the degree of power invested in them, and still more their recommendation of any measure whatever, not warranted by their commission, would not less excite animadversion than a recommendation at once of a measure fully commiserate to the national exigencies. Had the convention, under all these impressions and in the midst of all these considerations, instead of exercising a manly confidence in their country, by whose confidence they had been so peculiarly distinguished, and of pointing out a system capable, in their judgment, of securing its happiness, taken the cold and sullen resolution of disappointing its ardent hopes, of sacrificing substance to forms, of committing the dearest interest of their country to the uncertainties of delay and the hazard of events. Let me ask the man who can raise his mind to one elevated conception, who can awaken in his bosom one patriotic emotion. What judgment ought to have been pronounced by the impartial world, by the friends of mankind, by every virtuous citizen, on the conduct and character of this assembly? Or, if there be a man whose propensity to condemn is susceptible of no control, let me then ask what sentence he has in reserve for the 12 states who usurped the power of sending deputies to the convention, a body utterly unknown to their constitutions for Congress, who recommended the appointment of this body, equally unknown in the Confederation, and for the state of New York in particular, which first urged and then complied with this unauthorized interposition. But that the objectors may be disarmed of every pretext, it shall be granted for a moment that the convention were neither authorized by their commission nor justified by circumstances in proposing a constitution for their country. Does it follow that the Constitution ought, for that reason alone, to be rejected? If, according to the noble precept, it be lawful to accept good advice even from an enemy, we shall set the noble example of refusing such advice even when it is offered by our friends. The prudent inquiry, in all cases, ought surely to be, not so much from whom the advice comes, but whether the advice be good. The sum of what has been here advanced and proved is, that the charge against the convention of exceeding their powers, except in one instance, little urged by the objectors, has no foundation to support it. That if they had exceeded their powers, they were not only warranted, but required, as the confidential servants of their country, by the circumstances in which they were placed, to exercise the liberty which they assume, and that, finally, if they had violated both their powers and their obligations in proposing a constitution, this ought nevertheless to be embraced, if it be calculated to accomplish the views and happiness of the people of America. How far this character is due to the Constitution is the subject under investigation. And so we wrap up number 40. This whole series was just basically a defense of the Republic, right? We got a definition of the Republic. We got a listing of what the objections to the Republic were, and they were for large part contradictory and unfounded. That is the gist of what we've got from these last 4 letters. There are plenty more letters to come, and we have a lot more to discuss, but there's not a whole lot to add to these, right? These have been long adjudicated. People have studied this for a long time. It is well understood what the arguments were. We are merely repeating them out loud so that we can affirm the solidity of the Union. That is what I am doing. I believe in energetic investment. I know a lot of people don't. It is way too woo-woo for some people, but it is the exact same as praying for something and it happening. It's the exact same thing. You are investing your intentions in it. Well, my intentions is the preservation of the Union. I want us to get through this non-violently if possible, but I am open to other options because we cannot have a democracy. Like, we have some democratic systems, but we are not a democracy intentionally. We cannot give way to the rule of the mob. That is tyranny. That is how tyranny happens. Go to Plato right up here, right? It's continued in my playlist, in this playlist, the PittCast playlist. We read aloud the works of Plato so that we can understand the difference between a republic and a democracy. We understand now because we went through that. Our country is best when we are independent states acting in concert, when it is possible to go from this state, which has these laws, to another state, which has different laws, because you don't agree with the laws in that state, but you do with the laws in this state. That is the intention, that it is not supposed to be some monolith with 100% all the same laws everywhere. The laws that are everywhere are the federal ones. They are the ones that concern everyone. They have to do with our defense. They have to do with our monetary systems. They have to do with items of national import. They don't have to do with your daily life, and they should not. Those things have been excluded from the powers of the federal government. You have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You have the right given by God for all of the 10 Amendments. There is a reason why we got the 10 Amendments, and we see and hear why. We got the argument for that today. I'm sure we will get more of that argument coming. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a not too difficult topic. It is not hard to comprehend these. Again, this is an energetic investment. We are investing in the future of this country. I would love to save the world. I wish everybody would join our Constitution, but that's probably not going to happen. And so we have to keep them separate from us. We have the best system. Does it need help? Yes. Most of the help it needs is from us, not from the politicians, but by us putting the proper politicians into place, because that is our problem in writ large, right? The large problem that we have is us not being responsible in our duties and responsibilities as citizens of this republic. It is our job to ensure that the correct representatives are elected. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt State. Peace. All right, and now